Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in every emotionally giving person's life when they look back and wonder, how did I end up here? How did I become the one carrying all the weight, all the effort, all the love alone? If you've ever loved deeply, stayed too long, or tried to hold together something that kept falling apart, this is for you, because it's not just about heartbreak. It's about what happens after. What happens when the person who always showed up for everyone else finally decides to show up for themselves? This isn't just a story about healing pain, it's about how healing changes you. How it sharpens your standards, strengthens your voice, and softens your heart without allowing it to be walked on again. Let's talk about what really happens when the empath wakes up. Empaths are born with a heightened sense of emotional awareness. They don't just listen to words, they feel energy. They read body language, hear the emotion behind a sentence, and notice the shift in tone that others might miss entirely. This sensitivity is a superpower when used in the right environment, but when placed in a dynamic with someone emotionally unavailable or avoidant, that gift becomes their greatest vulnerability. When an empath encounters someone who fears intimacy, it often doesn't register immediately. The avoidant person may seem charming at first, even present. They might express interest, show flashes of vulnerability, and say the right things to create the illusion of connection. But underneath, there is a deep discomfort with closeness. They may crave love but fear the obligations that come with emotional intimacy. So they keep their heart guarded, protect their autonomy, and when things begin to feel too real, they pull away. And here's where the empath steps in with an open heart and a dangerous hope. Empaths by nature are fixers, not because they believe people are broken, but because they see potential where others see problems. They sense fear under coldness. They sense past wounds beneath silence. They sense hurt behind harshness, so instead of walking away from someone who can't show up emotionally, the empath often leans in further. They love harder, give more freely, and make emotional sacrifices not because they're foolish, but because they believe love can reach where logic can't. They think, if I just show them enough love, maybe they'll feel safe. If I can be patient enough, maybe they'll open up. If I give them more understanding, maybe they'll finally trust me. But what begins as compassion slowly morphs into overgiving. The empath starts ignoring their own needs. They rationalize the emotional gaps. They begin to call inconsistency complexity, and start redefining the emotional distance as just someone who needs time. They accept breadcrumbs because they've convinced themselves it's their job to prove love to someone who has never truly accepted it, and the avoidant partner, often unintentionally, reinforces this cycle. They don't ask the empath to stop giving. In fact, they benefit from the empath's emotional labor. It allows them to stay comfortable in the shallow end, never having to risk true vulnerability, because someone else is always doing the emotional heavy lifting. The empath becomes the emotional anchor for both, carrying the relationship while quietly losing themselves in the process. It's not that the avoidant person is evil or cruel, it's that they're scared. Scared of being known, scared of needing someone, scared of being abandoned, even while they're the ones creating the very distance they fear. But the empath internalizes that fear and turns it inward. They start believing that if only they were better, more patient, more chill, more emotionally self-sufficient, maybe the person would stay. They begin to shrink themselves to accommodate someone who fears their light. What makes this dynamic so painful is that empaths don't give with expectation. They don't give to manipulate. They give because they want to heal. But healing isn't a one-sided process, and no amount of love can reach someone who has chosen self, protection over vulnerability. Still, the empath tries, believing they're the exception, believing that if they can just love right, they'll be the one to change the story. But there's a difference between loving someone through their wounds and bleeding out for them. The line gets blurred when your empathy turns into emotional self-abandonment, when your instinct to help someone becomes a pattern of betraying your own needs. When the relationship becomes a series of silent compromises where you are always the one reaching, texting first, forgiving again, holding space, and never truly being held in return. And it's not just the emotional labor that wears the empath down. It's the deep inner conflict of loving someone who constantly keeps you at arm's length. It's the tension of feeling everything and yet never being fully seen. It's the heartbreak of realizing your softness is being met with silence, not because you're unlovable, but because you've chosen someone who isn't ready for the depth you offer. Empaths often don't stop giving because they're naive. They stop because eventually the giving becomes exhausting. Eventually, they wake up to the fact that love shouldn't feel like proving, that connection shouldn't come at the cost of their dignity. And when that moment comes, the empath doesn't just pull away to protect their heart, they do it to reclaim their identity. Because love, real love, doesn't require you to lose yourself to keep someone else. Avoidant partners rarely start off showing their true emotional pattern. In the beginning, they can be engaging, intriguing, even intense. They may pursue with charm, initiate deep conversations, and make you feel special, like you've finally met someone who gets you. But underneath that initial warmth is a fear that quietly shapes how they connect, the fear of true emotional intimacy. For an avoidant person, closeness feels threatening. It's not that they don't want connection, it's that they want it on their terms that don't involve vulnerability, consistency, or emotional accountability. So rather than setting healthy boundaries or communicating directly, they create confusion. And that confusion often shows up in mixed signals. They text you late at night, telling you they've been thinking about you, only to disappear for days. They open up emotionally in one moment just enough to make you feel close and then shut down the next. They say things like, "I'm just not good at relationships," or "I've been hurt before," and use these admissions not to build deeper understanding, but to justify their distance and inconsistency. And this is where the manipulation begins, not in the form of loud rejection or overt cruelty, but in the silence, in the ambiguity, and in the way they keep the connection just alive enough to keep you hoping for more. Mixed signals are not just confusing, they're emotionally destabilizing. You begin to question your perception, doubt your instincts, and second, guess your emotional needs. When you express concern or hurt, the avoidant partner may respond with defensiveness or turn the blame around. "You're overthinking, you're too sensitive, I never said this was serious." This form of gaslighting is subtle. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It makes you feel that maybe you are asking for too much when, in truth, you're asking for the basics: presence, honesty, clarity, and emotional safety. And yet, avoidant partners excel at creating emotional highs and lows. One moment you feel incredibly connected, maybe they compliment you, recall something meaningful you told them, or open up just enough to give you hope. Then, as soon as things feel emotionally real, they back off. They need space, they're just busy. They retreat, leaving you to fill in the silence with assumptions, doubts, and longing. This push and pull dynamic is not accidental. It conditions you to work harder for their affection. You start thinking, maybe if I'm more understanding, they'll come around. You become emotionally trained to accept the bare minimum, to tolerate emotional withholding as a personality trait rather than an incompatibility. You forgive again and again because you remember who they were in the beginning, even if that version of them only shows up in rare flashes. And the cruel twist is, the more inconsistent they are, the more hooked you feel. It's not because you're weak, it's because unpredictability creates anxiety, and anxiety, when paired with intermittent reward, can feel like chemistry. You begin to interpret inconsistency as passion, silence as mystery, emotional unavailability as depth. But this is the trap. The avoidant partner has learned consciously or not how to maintain control through distance. They withhold affection just long enough to keep you chasing. They open up just enough to keep you invested. They never fully reject, but never fully commit either, and in doing so, they create an emotional environment where you feel like you're always reaching, never arriving. The emotional withholding isn't just about space. It's about power. The avoidant partner stays in control by keeping you emotionally off balance. You become afraid to ask for clarity because you fear pushing them away. You censor your feelings to avoid being labeled too much. You begin to tiptoe around your own needs, while theirs remain untouched and unquestioned. And still, you hold on not because the relationship is fulfilling, but because it's familiar. Because you've become invested in proving your worth to someone who never truly made you feel secure in the first place. The most painful part is that they may never fully cut ties. They'll reach out when they sense you're pulling away. They'll say something kind just when you've had enough, and you'll think, maybe this time it's different. But the cycle continues. The emotional crumbs never become a meal. The clarity never arrives. The commitment never deepens. Avoidant partners may not see themselves as manipulative. Many are simply acting out their own unresolved wounds, but the result is still the same: confusion, self-doubt, emotional depletion. The very tools they use to protect themselves, withholding, avoidance, mixed signals, become weapons that erode the emotional health of anyone who gets too close. There's a reason so many people stay in relationships that hurt more than they heal. It's not always about love. It's not even always about hope. Sometimes it's about something much more deceptive, a feeling we misread as chemistry, when in fact it's emotional confusion creating self-doubt so strong we mistake it for deep connection. Emotional chemistry, that electric magnetic pull, is often seen as the gold standard in romantic connection. We're told to trust it, to chase it, to follow the spark, but no one warns us that sometimes that spark comes from friction, not alignment. From anxiety, not safety. From trying to earn love, not receiving it freely. This is the space where manipulation doesn't show up as control or cruelty. It shows up as ambiguity. It shows up as someone who says they care but never really shows up when it matters. It shows up in unanswered texts, hot and cold behavior, or sudden changes in tone that leave you wondering what you did wrong. And then, instead of questioning them, you start questioning yourself. Did I come on too strong? Was I too emotional? Maybe I shouldn't have said anything at all. You convince yourself that your emotional reactions are the issue, rather than the inconsistent behavior that caused them. And the deeper that doubt settles in, the stronger the emotional bond feels, not because there's actual closeness, but because your nervous system is constantly trying to solve a problem it didn't create. It's like a loop. You feel a sudden surge of attention from them, and it lights you up. Then they withdraw, no explanation, no warning, and you're left in silence. Your brain, now activated by the high of their affection and the low of their absence, becomes addicted to the unpredictability. You confuse the cycle of anxiety and relief with love, and before you even realize it, you've started equating emotional turbulence with passion. What you don't see is that this dynamic feeds on your self-doubt. It requires you to constantly work harder to be chosen. You start editing your words, you pull back your emotions, you become cautious, calculating, walking on emotional eggshells in hopes of not scaring them off. But deep down, you're not scared of losing them. You're scared that if they go, it confirms your worst fear, that you weren't enough. This is where the manipulation lies, not always in what the other person says, but in what they withhold. Not in the fights, but in the silence. Not in abuse, but in the emotional absence that makes you feel like you have to do more just to keep their attention. And the more they pull away, the more you chase, not because of love, but because the emotional imbalance has conditioned you to believe that your worth depends on their response. Sometimes they come back just in time. They say something sweet, they touch your arm, they open up just a little, and that glimpse of closeness, that flash of the connection you've been missing, resets the cycle. You feel like maybe the chemistry is back. Maybe things are getting better, but nothing's really changed. You've just been momentarily reassured enough to stay, but never enough to feel secure. This is why self-doubt disguised as chemistry is so dangerous. It doesn't just keep you in a relationship, it keeps you believing the problem is you. It makes you normalize being emotionally malnourished. It makes you believe you're lucky to receive breadcrumbs, because maybe that's all someone like you deserves. It turns your empathy into overfunctioning, your hope into self-sacrifice, and your love into survival mode. And the saddest part is, you may start to lose sight of who you were before this dynamic began. The confident, grounded, intuitive version of yourself gets buried beneath layers of self-blame. You start to romanticize inconsistency. You crave the highs because the lows are so frequent, and the chaos feels oddly comforting because it's familiar. But emotional manipulation doesn't always wear a villain's face. Sometimes it comes in the form of inconsistency that leaves you feeling uncertain and inadequate. Sometimes it's not a person's presence that manipulates you, it's the space between their presence and their absence that does the damage. And because you've confused that damage with depth, you stay. Not because it feels good, but because you're hoping to feel the way you did in the beginning again back when they gave just enough to hook you. That wasn't chemistry, that was control through confusion. And the longer it continues, the deeper the doubt grows and the more chemistry you think you have. There's a moment that doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. No yelling, no slammed doors, no breakdown. But inside it feels like something irreversible has shifted. That's the moment of clarity. It doesn't come with fire, it comes with stillness, not a reaction, but a realization, and that realization ends what emotional chaos never could. For so long, you might have been trapped in a cycle that confused love with longing. You stayed because you believed there was something worth fighting for, maybe because of how good it felt in the beginning, or how deeply you saw the potential in someone, or how much you believed in the power of loyalty and love to change things. You didn't stay because you were foolish, you stayed because you cared, but caring without clarity turns into chaos. You give more, you try harder, you justify their distance. You silence your needs, not because you don't have them, but because every time you bring them up, they make you feel like you're the problem. You think, maybe I'm asking too much, maybe I'm too intense. Maybe if I just love them a little better, they'll finally show up. That thinking keeps you stuck. It keeps you giving long after the relationship stopped giving back. It turns you into someone who's always waiting for a text, for a change, for an apology that never comes. You keep hanging on, not because it feels good, but because it used to. You confuse the memory of connection with the presence of love, and at some point you reach your limit, but it's not an explosion. It's not rage, it's not even heartbreak in the way you imagined. It's quiet, it's soft, it's that breath you take when you stop trying to convince yourself that it's working, when you stop hoping for potential and start seeing patterns. When you stop reacting emotionally to their distance and start recognizing it as a choice, not a phase, that's clarity. It's not loud, but it's final. It's the calm after the storm, when you look around and realize nothing is going to change, and more importantly, that you don't need it to anymore, because you're not trying to win them over. You're not clinging to the version of them that only exists when they fear losing you. You're not staying to prove your worth to someone who keeps forgetting how valuable you are. You see clearly, and that's what sets you free. Anger burns fast. It makes you say things you don't mean, lash out, demand answers. It feels powerful in the moment, but often fades, replaced by guilt or more confusion. Clarity, on the other hand, stays. It grounds you. It doesn't demand revenge. It doesn't even need closure. Because once you understand that their inconsistency, their emotional withholding, their inability to meet you where you are, that all of it wasn't your fault, you no longer feel compelled to fight for a seat at a table that was never built for two. The person on the other side of that clarity might not even understand what's changed. They may still try their push-and-pull tactics. They might reach out again, say the right thing, act like nothing happened. But you've changed. You're no longer looking for a response to validate your decision. You're not hoping they'll finally understand your pain. You're simply done, not with anger, but with certainty. Because when you gain clarity, you no longer need chaos to justify walking away. You see the full picture now, not just the highlights, not just the hopeful moments, not just the words that sounded like promises. You see the silence, the avoidance, the emotional crumbs you kept accepting as proof of connection. You see how often you made excuses for their absence. And more than anything, you see how far you've drifted from yourself in trying to hold on to them. And suddenly, letting go doesn't feel like losing. It feels like remembering. The cycle ends not because you fought harder. It ends because you finally stopped fighting for someone who wouldn't fight for you. It ends because clarity came in and showed you what anger never could, that your peace was never meant to be negotiated, that your worth was never meant to be proved, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to get louder. It's to get clear. Healing doesn't always look like we expect. It doesn't always arrive with closure. It doesn't always come after an apology, and it almost never looks like a perfect, linear process. Especially for the empath, the one who has given too much, stayed too long, and carried the weight of two hearts in a relationship where only one was truly showing up. An empath doesn't just love, they immerse. They feel someone's silence like a scream. They can sense tension before it's spoken, and they'll often adjust themselves to keep the peace long before the other person even realizes there's a storm. That sensitivity is beautiful, but it also makes them vulnerable to being taken for granted, especially by someone who sees their patience as permission. When an empath is wounded, their first instinct is often to understand the other person. They replay conversations, try to empathize with the avoidant behavior, and hold space for someone else's pain even while they're drowning in their own. They confuse tolerance with love and emotional labor with loyalty. But the truth is, staying soft in a space that keeps hardening you isn't compassion, it's self-abandonment dressed as devotion. But something happens when the empath chooses healing, not just the kind of healing that soothes the pain, but the kind that rewires their sense of what they truly deserve. At first, healing is uncomfortable. It means facing the truth about what they accepted. It means realizing that the breadcrumbs they mistook for love were never enough. It means acknowledging how often they betrayed their own boundaries in the name of understanding someone who rarely met them halfway. And that part hurts not because they weren't strong, but because they had to shrink their needs to survive a relationship that couldn't hold their full heart. But slowly, as the fog clears, something deeper shifts. The pain doesn't just fade, it teaches, and that teaching doesn't just make the empath more cautious, it elevates their standards. They no longer romanticize intensity if it comes without safety. They no longer excuse inconsistency because of what someone's been through. They stop confusing emotional chaos with depth. They no longer feel flattered by people who can't offer stability, because healing has taught them something vital. Love without peace isn't love that lasts. It's love that depletes. They begin to recognize that the one-sidedness they used to tolerate is no longer tolerable, not because they're bitter, but because they've come back to themselves. They've remembered their capacity, their value, their needs. And those needs are no longer shameful or too much. They are valid, and they are no longer up for negotiation. And the beauty of this transformation is that it doesn't harden the empath, it clarifies them. They still feel deeply, but now they direct that depth inward before they pour it outward. They still love, but now they love with discernment, not desperation. They still believe in connection, but now they require consistency. And most importantly, they stop trying to earn what should be given freely. They become more selective, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. They stop entertaining situations that feel heavy before they've even begun. They stop chasing people who pull away at the first sign of emotional closeness. They recognize that emotional unavailability isn't mysterious, it's incompatible. They stop seeing their empathy as a reason to stay and start using it as a reason to walk when the relationship lacks mutual effort. What once felt like strength, holding on, fixing, overgiving, now looks like what it was, survival. And now that they're no longer in survival mode, their standards reflect someone who's done trying to prove they're worthy. They know they are. They don't settle for maybe or almost or sometimes. They wait for someone who meets them in the middle, not someone who keeps them on the edge. Healing hasn't made them colder. It's made them clearer. It hasn't made them selfish, it's made them self-honoring. The pain didn't just leave a scar, it left a lesson. And that lesson is this: when your empathy is used against you, your healing becomes your responsibility. And when you truly heal, you don't just feel better, you choose better, not because you're afraid of being hurt again, but because you finally know how deeply you deserve not to be. And when the empath finally heals, the world doesn't just see someone who's stronger, it sees someone who's no longer available for half love, for emotional guessing games, for relationships that make them doubt their worth. They become the version of themselves that no longer asks, "Am I too much?" but instead calmly says, "I need more than this." That's what true healing does. It teaches you that peace isn't a luxury in love, it's the foundation. And once you've found it within yourself, you never again trade it for someone else's chaos.